All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2025 ISAR Virtuaeolian Seminar Series. The entire ISAR board is excited to continue the Virtuaeolian tradition with Colin Marvin. Before I turn it over to him, here's the structure of how today's webinar will go. Please keep your microphones off unless called on in the Q&A session. Feel free, though, to type questions in the chat at any time. We will be waiting until the end to read those aloud. During the Q&A, you can also raise your hand if you'd prefer to speak aloud. The meeting is being recorded and will be shared with the ISAR community. Please hang with us till the very end. We'll also share some important ISAR updates. And lastly, we ask everyone to contribute to creating and maintaining a welcoming and respectful working environment that fosters diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And now a short intro on Colin. Colin is a fourth-year PhD student at Stanford University, working with Dr. Mathieu Lepotre. Broadly speaking, his research is focused on how environmental conditions are recorded in sedimentary landscapes on planetary surfaces throughout the solar system. At the grain scale, he surveys differences between surface features, or microtextures, observed on detrital zircons from a range of transport environments, with the goal of unlocking Precambrian sedimentary record. At the dune field scale, he investigates how dunes of different morphologies adjust to changing environmental conditions, with the fundamental implications for how shifts in boundary conditions are recorded in dune patterns. He's also interested in environmental conditions recorded in dunes of Earth, Mars, and Titan. Before attending Stanford, he studied geography, GIS, and mathematics at Arizona State University. And with that, I welcome you, Colin, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Maddie. Yeah, so I'm really excited to share with everybody today some work that I and some wonderful collaborators have been doing on detrital zircons. These are pretty hardy minerals, and they have quite a knack for recording really, really old environmental conditions that we can interpret from rocks. So with that, Maddie did a wonderful job of introducing me. I am a PhD student. I work with Mathieu Lepotre, and we have some wonderful PhD students. We don't just do sedimentology and Aeolian geomorphology. We've done everything from impact craters to meandering rivers to tsunamis on Mars. And if you have a sec, you should definitely check out our lab website. Like Maddie mentioned, I mostly focus on dune patterns, and so this talk is really switching scales from what we observe at the dune field scale to the individual nicks and cracks and fractures on the surfaces of individual sand grains. So I mentioned I had some wonderful collaborators. These are them. I have four: my wonderful advisor, Mathieu, Michael Hassan and Vittorio Colici, who are both PhD students in the lab, and Raisha Abubo, who is now a senior. She's an undergrad working with our group, has been working with us for the past 2 years, and is now graduating here in a couple weeks. A lot of the sediment that I'm actually going to be talking about that we've analyzed came from a lot of wonderful folks from around the world, particularly people from the Aeolian community. Carlos Alvarez Zambrano, Charlie Bristow, Ryan Ewing, Andrew Gunn, Christy Swan, Andrew Valdez from Great Sand Dunes are all folks who sent in some samples along with all of the other folks listed. So this work would not have been possible with all those samples, so thank you very much. But on to the science. First of all, this talk is based around the idea that there is sand all over the place on Earth's surface. If you go to the beach, you're going to find sand, hopefully. If you go to a glacier, there'll be sand in the moraines and around the margins of the glacier. There's sand in river systems and point bars and attached bars. And of course, the sand that we are most interested in, sand in sand dunes. Now, the different forces that transport these grains will shape them and texture them differently. You can see just how different some of these sand grains look from common continental transport environments. So beaches, windblown dunes, glaciers, and beaches. And you can imagine that a grain that is saltating along on a dune might look a little bit different than a grain that's being crushed by a glacier. So in the Aeolian case, we have a nice, smooth, well-rounded grain, whereas a glacial grain is crushed and fractured and quite sharp. Now, people have been looking at textures on sand grains for quite a long time. In fact, since the scanning electron microscope, or SEM, became popular in the 1960s, folks have been putting sand from different environments under the microscope, looking at it and documenting those textures. There are whole atlases where each of the chapters are a given environment, and there's pages upon pages of the textures that are characteristic of a given environment. Some of those textures you might be familiar with, edge rounding or low relief or conchoidal fractures, and some you may not. Abrasion fatigue or crescentic percussion marks. There's a wide variety of chemical and physical textures and combined chemical physical textures as well. And the vast majority of this work has been done on quartz, and that's because quartz sand is durable, it's found all over the place, and it will retain textures readily. Now, a really cool application of this work is to the rock record. So if you went out to the Otter Sandstone Formation, for example, as Dave Crinsley and colleagues did in 1976, and you disaggregated this Aeolian sandstone, and you took these grains and put them under a scanning electron microscope and looked at them, you would realize that they looked very, very similar to modern wind-blown grains. And so, if these grains are available in rocks to look at, they can be a really wonderful source of information, in addition to the stratigraphy and other context clues that we can use to tell you something about the environment that these rocks were formed in. Now, uh, if done well, a quartz textural analysis can give you a lot of information. However, there are some drawbacks. So, first of all, it takes a really long time. You have to get these grains, you have to mount them and image them and go through them grain by grain to look for a bunch of textures, log those textures manually, and then conduct a statistical analysis. And what ends up coming from that statistical analysis is you reduce all of the information from all of the grains that you look at to a single data point. And so that can become an issue if you're looking at an environment like this over here on the right, where you have a river that is draining sand out onto a beach. It's being moved in the swash zone and then blown up into an Aeolian dune. So you're going to get mixed signals that show up on all of these grains that might not tell you the more complicated transport history of a given grain. Now, an additional sort of aspect to this is that this sort of analysis is subjective, and it's interpretive. And if I sat down and I looked at a whole suite of grains and I logged a bunch of textures and I passed it on to the next researcher, they took a look as well and logged grains on those same textures, you might come up with different results. And so these sort of analyses are not as reproducible or comparable as we might like them to be. And sort of the gold standard as of a couple years ago for how to approach this sort of analysis is using a principal component analysis. And so this is a study from Jocelyn Rail and colleagues from 2021, and they looked at grains from Aeolian environments, fluvial environments, and glacial environments. And so they take all of these common textures that you might find that can be found throughout each of these three environments. You perform the statistical analysis and you see where these different environments plot in this parameter space. And you'll notice that each of these points is one given site where all of the information from tens of grains is being reduced to a single data point. You can see that these environments separate out relatively well, but there's not a lot of nuance here. And again, this is because it can be subjective. This is a list of 15 to 20 of the 40 to 60 recognized textures that we have. And if you were to do a textural analysis and identify some textures that you might be interested in, you might realize that something like subparallel linear fractures is very similar to straight grooves and very similar to deep troughs. And so it might be difficult between researchers to figure out what these sort of differences may be. This happens to be a wonderful task for machine learning. And again, we're still talking about quartz. I'll switch over to Zircon here in a second, but quartz really provides the basis for the sort of analysis that we're going to be doing on Zircon. So you can take, in this example, a bunch of images of grains from beaches from all over the world and sand dunes and glaciers and rivers, and you can feed them into the machine learning model, and it can learn all of the different ways that grains that are blown by winds and crushed by glaciers and transported subaqueously on a beach face and on a river can look. And then to see how well you're doing, you can take a bunch of other images from sites from the same types of environments, but sites that the model hasn't seen at all. And you can feed it in and see how well it does. And if you're happy with that, you can do it with a rock record as well. You can go out and you can disaggregate these sandstones. You can image the grains, put them into the model, and be confident about the sorts of interpretations that the model is providing. So to do this on quartz, my colleague Michael Hassan collected a wide variety of sediment samples from around the world from these four common environments: windblown dunes, rivers, glaciers, and beaches. And doing just that, feeding in all these images and letting the model learn, on individual sand grains, it can predict up to 96% accurately on windblown grains, and at the very worst case, 83% accurately on fluvial grains. And again, this is on individual grains, not on the bulk sample of tens of grains that you're looking at. And so if you take the most common prediction from all of the grains that you image in a sample, it is 100% accurate on all four of these sites, which is pretty fantastic. So we can now take this and apply it to sites that the model hasn't seen yet and the rock record. And this means that with the very worst case, this fluvial site with around 83% accuracy, that you only need 5 grains to be around 95% sure of a given environment. And usually you'll image 30 to 50 grains. And so 5 is really just a handful. Now, we can also tell what the model is actually doing. Machine learning can seem like a bit of a black box, but we can kind of tease out what the model is actually using to differentiate between environments, because we as humans are saying, oh, look, there's some V-shaped percussion cracks and there's some edge rounding and some crescentic grooves, for example. But the model isn't doing that. It's just looking at images and differentiating accordingly. And so we can kind of tease that out using something called a class activation map. And so if we were instead interested in puppies and kittens rather than sand grains, we can see here that this particular model is really using the faces of these animals to tell them apart. The heat map is showing that, oh, the puppy is really hot, and the kitten sort of in the middle and where its face is quite warm as well. And the cooler colors are less interesting to the model. It's really using the faces of these animals to differentiate between them. We can do the same thing with textures. And the idea here to really hone in on this is to remove particular areas of images and repredict to figure out the most important parts of the image. And so what we did is we took sort of characteristic grains from each of these environments and identified regions of these grains that are textures that are indicative of each of these environments. And so we can focus over here on the left in the Aeolian column. One thing that is really characteristic of Aeolian grains is a nice, smooth, round edge. And so that ER, that blue, I've traced all the way around the Aeolian grain because it's super well rounded. And so it seems, using this particular layer, that around the edge of this Aeolian grain, where it's really, really hot, the model is also using edge rounding as something that is predictive of Aeolian grains. Whereas on something like a glacial grain, a beach grain, or a fluvial grain, it's instead focusing on individual textures in the center of that grain rather than the whole grain outline. Now, that's pretty sweet, but let's see how it does with a bunch of samples that it hasn't seen before. And so we tried this with, again, Aeolian and fluvial and glacial and beach grains, and it does quite well, particularly on Aeolian grains. They're very, very distinct. And so if we fed in grains from the Grand Erg Oriental or the Namib Desert, you can see that the model predicts that they're basically 100% Aeolian. And similarly with beach grains from California, those plot in the corner of this beach corner of the ternary diagram. And one thing that sticks out is this one fluvial sample, this DB. This is from the lower reaches of the Mississippi River. It doesn't plot in the fluvial corner, which is a bit funky. And this might make you think, well, hey, maybe the model isn't doing so well. But when we take a step back and we see where that sand is coming from, a lot of the sediment that goes into the Mississippi River is being sourced from these stabilized dune fields and less deposits in the upper Midwest. That sand is being eroded, moved into the Mississippi River, and then flushed out as it moves downstream towards the delta. And so what we're actually imaging, and what the model is realizing, is that there's a true mixed fluvial Aeolian signal where grains are bounced along in Aeolian environments. They are deposited and then eroded and retextured as they move down a river. Now we can take this and apply it to the rock record. And so we went out to a nice stack of rocks in Utah. This is in southern Utah, and take a look at some really well-studied, independently identified sandstones. And so we're going to take a look at the Entrada Formation, the Gunsight Butte Member, and the Navajo Sandstone. Here's some images from some of those sites, and you can see once again, these are all Aeolian in nature, and they're really well-rounded, particularly in the Navajo case. And when we predict on them, we can see that the Navajo sandstone is, of course, up in the Aeolian corner, and the Gunsight Butte and Entrada are also quite Aeolian. We have these really well-studied fluvial sandstones, the Nomogene and the Eocene gravels, which are both quite fluvial. And we'll skip over the beach here, but the Merced as well in the bottom left of the right plot is also quite beach. But let's focus on perhaps some Aeolian grains. This is an Aeolian seminar. Let's take a look at these two, AE and BR. BR is the cryogenian Brevica member. So this is cryogenian in age. It is sampled from Svalbard up in Norway. And it seems to be a little Aeolian, but perhaps a bit of a glacial influence. It's being pulled down the side of this ternary diagram. Now, this was sampled by Jocelyn Rail and others for their 2021 paper, but the Brevica member is quite enigmatic in that it's been interpreted as everything from a fluvial tropical outwash plain to glacial to Aeolian, and so there's really not a consensus. The only consensus is that it's associated with snowball Earth because there's cap carbonate and diamictite sandwiching this layer. But the Brevica has some undeformed grains, so we can take them out, we can analyze them, and feed them through the model. Some site photos from Rail et al. You can see some pinstripe lamination and some cross bedding, which is indicative of Aeolian transport. But when we feed it through the model, we get a dominant Aeolian signature of around 83%, but also this secondary glacial signature, and it's not small. It's 17%, and so this is pretty interesting. So this suggests that it could be some sort of periglacial Aeolian sample. And Rail et al. In their 2021 work suggests that from a textural analysis and from their stratigraphy that it is Aeolian in nature. But remember, these past studies reduce all of this information to a single data point. And so you can only get information about whether or not it's Aeolian or glacial or beach or fluvial, not the relative influences of each of these environments, which we can do with this model. And it plots really, really close to this AE sample. These are from Antarctica. These are from the dry valleys. And similarly, you see this dominant Aeolian signature with a secondary glacial signature, which means that this is probably very, very similar to what we see in modern day Antarctica, where we have these glacial grains being eroded and blown into these periglacial dune fields. This also implies that windblown processes are going to resurface these grains really, really quickly. And that example of the glacial grains that I showed, they're really crushed and jagged, whereas the Aeolian grains are really well rounded. This is pretty sweet, and it suggests that there is a true periglacial Aeolian signature that can pop out, which is quite exciting. But anyway, this work by my lab mate Michael shows that you can classify both modern and ancient sand grains using this machine learning model. Pretty sweet. It's reliable in both bulk classification, excuse me, but also on individual grains, which can tell you more about the variability within a sample. And most importantly, microtextural analyses on quartz are now automated and objective. I highly recommend that you check this out. The model is available online for anyone to use. All you need is SEM images, and you can feed it through. And within a couple seconds, you can get grain by grain analyses of of your sample. But this talk is about zircon, so we're going to switch back really quick. Quartz textures are great, but the further you go back into the rock record, the more issues you're going to run into. So quartz grains are susceptible to recrystallization. You can see here that these grains from the Dakota Formation are recrystallized. They have the original quartz forms beginning to form around the original transported surface of the grain. And if you want to do a textural analysis, you need to see the textures. And so if these grains are recrystallized, it means that this sort of analysis is infeasible. And further on, the further and further you go back into the rock record, all the way back to the Precambrian, to the Archean, this is 2.5 to 4 billion years ago, you're going to run into a lot more issues, not just with looking at quartz textures, which are going to be obscured by diagenesis and metamorphism, but the other clues that we as sedimentologists and stratigraphers can use to interpret a stack of rocks become really, really murky. So mud distribution is going to be different. There's no macrofossils because there's no animals. There's no vegetation because there's no plants. And so these things are either completely absent or completely different, which presents problems in its own right. And other sort of workarounds that we can use, bed form analyses, can lead to non-unique conclusions because we can find a variety of bed forms, ripples and dunes, in a whole suite of different transport environments. So what we propose to do is a textural analysis, but not on quartz. Now, our hypothesis is that zircon grains also hold surface textures and can be used to indicate transport environment. Here we have some grains from South Africa. These are on the order of 3 billion years old. They're really quite rounded and were interpreted to be Aeolian in nature. Now, looking at surface textures on heavy minerals or even on zircon grains specifically isn't a new idea. And there's a variety of studies out there. But most of these are site-specific or associated with provenance studies. And so what's lacking is a systematic analysis of the sorts of textures and their variability across grains from different transport environments. And so on quartz, this was done by Jocelyn Rail and others, but we're going to do something similar. We're going to take a whole suite of samples from across the world from a variety of transport environments and see what pops out. So we have a bunch of samples from 3 common continental transport environments. We're looking at Aeolian sites, beach sites, and fluvial sites. And we'll get into this sort of mixed and recycled grains and grains of uncertain origin here later on. We have grains from beautiful California beaches, from Bondi Beach in Australia, Praia das Canasvieiras in Brazil, smaller fluvial systems like the Snoqualmie in my home state of Washington, larger systems like the Songhuajian in China. We have smaller dune fields like Algodones in California, larger systems like the Rub al Khali in Saudi Arabia and the Namib Sand Sea in Namibia. And now that we have all of our samples, we can get to analyzing. Zircon is a common constituent of sands, just as quartz is, but common in a relative sense. Quartz, if you scoop up a handful of quartz or sand at the beach, it's going to be predominantly quartz, a little bit of feldspar. There's going to be zircon in there, but on the order of, say, thousands to tens of thousands of grains per million grains. And so if we just take a scoop and we start sorting through them, it's going to take a really long time to get enough zircon grains to look at. So we have to separate them in a very particular manner. First up is the magnetic separation. Some of the chemicals that we're going to be using later on react with iron, and so we want to get iron-rich grains out. Next, we wash them in hydrochloric acid. This is to remove the iron oxides and carbonates from the surface of grains, which could otherwise obscure their textures. And then to really isolate these really dense grains, for context, quartz is 2650 kilograms per cubic meter, whereas zircon is much more dense. It's about 4,700 kilograms per cubic meter. So we can use a liquid with a density that is intermediate of those, such that when we mix our sediment together, the less dense or light grains, the quartz and feldspar, is going to float, and the more dense grains like zircon is going to sink. You can rinse those off and then image them in the scanning electron microscope, or SEM. This is what we're working with. This is the sort of images that are going to come out of this analysis. So we have an SEM micrograph, we have a grain, and from it, we can get textural and shape information. We're going to start off with shape. So from a raw image, we can make it binary using a software like ImageJ, for example, where the background is black and the foreground, the grain, is white. Get that grain outline, and then using this software, we can get a variety of different shape descriptors. We can get the median grain size, the circularity, the roundness, the aspect ratio, and solidity. For textures, we're going to log a suite of 12 textures that can be found across all of these different transport environments. And we're just looking for their presence or absence. So for texture 1, I'm going to go through and see if anywhere on the grain that texture is there. If it is, we'll give it a 1. If it's not, we'll give it a 0. And from that, the column averages will tell you the average percent occurrence of a texture on a given grain. So say you're looking at 10 grains, and 4 of them have conchoidal fractures present, you can say that 40% of the grains have conchoidal fractures on them. And you do this for all of the different textures, all 12 of them, for all of the sites that you're looking at. This is what that looks like for one site. And so you go through grain by grain and log the textures. This is for one site. This is Algodones Dunes. We're looking at minimum 50 grains per site. And I have documented we'll say on the order of 1,500 grains, 12 textures per grain. A lot of data that we're working with here. This is what it looks like. We can see that across the 3 environments that we're interested in, we get a wide range of grain morphologies, ranging from almost perfectly ahedral to really well-rounded in Aeolian, beach, and fluvial environments. And so when we try to separate out these different environments using a principal component analysis, looking at shape, it doesn't do particularly well. You can see here that unlike Jocelyn Rail's example of a PCA where you have each of the different environments clustering, relatively nicely, here we have a big mash of data. We don't see any separation from what we see from the shapes. And given the example of the different images from the different environments and their starting shapes and their ending shapes from really ahedral to really well-rounded, this sort of makes sense. But in contrast, we do a principal component analysis on the textures, we do indeed get some clustering, and our environments that we're interested in separate out really nicely. We first have our Aeolian sites, which are the most positive along principal component 1 or PC1. We have our fluvial sites, which are the most negative along principal component 1. We have our beach sites, which are somewhere in the middle. Now, the different textures will provide a sort of insight into what is driving these different data points to different sides of this parameter space. So low relief and edge rounding, these are textures that are really common in Aeolian environments. And so it makes sense that these loading vectors are pulling that Aeolian data off to the right. And we're going to swing around to see which of these textures are moving grains in different environments. That is, if you have a predominance of a given texture, where is that going to pull a given site in this parameter space? So we have V-shaped percussion cracks, linear steps, subparallel linear fractures, arc-shaped steps, conchoidal fractures, high relief, medium relief, sharp angular features, and curve grooves. So whereas the Aeolian sites are being characterized mostly by edge rounding and low relief, these really smooth grains, in contrast, what's happening over on the left side, the most negative PC1 values in the fluvial environments, those are grains that have predominantly high and medium relief, sharp angular features, and curve grooves. Now, we did something similar with our rock record samples as well. Just in case there is something imparting or taking away textures during diagenesis or during metamorphism, we did these principal component analyses differently. But when you apply the weights from the modern environments and apply them to the rock record, it works quite well as well. We're going to dig into this later in the discussion, but for now, what really pops out is we still have our three clusters. We have the Navajo sandstone, Aeolian, really well-rounded, the Merced Formation, beach, somewhere in the middle, and these auriferous gravels, fluvial off on the other side. And once again, just like we did in the modern environments, we have these three clusters where Aeolian is off to one side, fluvial is on the other, beach is somewhere in the middle. The Aeolian environments are predominantly controlled by low relief and edge rounding, and the fluvial environments are predominantly controlled by sharp angular features and medium and high relief. Now, let's talk about what is actually providing a lot of this variability along principal component 1 along the x-axis and principal component 2 along the y-axis. So we have our three environments, subaerial environments, the Aeolian and the subaqueous, the fluvial and the beach. It is pretty great that we can think about this in terms of sort of transport energy. You can imagine that two grains that are saltating along on a dune field are colliding quite violently, and they're rounding off the edges of grains, whereas those collisions in fluvial environments or even subaqueous environments, those are viscously damped. So as two grains come together and impact one another, that impact energy is dampened by the viscous forces of the water. So we have a much higher impact energy and a much narrower range in impact energies in Aeolian environments as compared to fluvial. Now, along principal component 2, it seems like this is really controlled by transport distance, or the amount of time that a grain is in a given system. And so those lower principal component 2 values are sort of the smaller systems, where as the elevated principal component 2 values are sort of these larger systems. And so this kind of makes sense when we take a look at where each of these sites are plotting. So these steep, shallow streams, for example, the Estero Repiermo in Chile, this is a really small PC2 value compared to these really large fluvial systems like the San Juan. And similarly, these isolated pocket beaches like Gray Whale have much smaller PC2 values than these large dissipative beaches like Pomponio. And similarly in Aeolian environments, where these isolated or local dune fields like algodones or great sand dunes pictured here are going to have much lower principal component 2 values than, say, the Rubal Hali or the Namib Sansi, which have much higher principal component 2 values. We also have to deal with recycling. Grains don't just fall out of granite and get moved into one environment and there they stay. They will continue to be eroded and transported across Earth's surface. We can pick up on that signal in modern and in ancient settings as well. And so in this case, from the Mississippi River, we have Aeolian grains being transported by a fluvial system. And so you can see that the Mississippi River, I've been there, it is a river. We collected the sediment from a river, but in this parameter space, we can see that it's more similar to Aeolian grains, and that's because of the history of that sand. So just like in the quartz case, this is from the exact same sample, we can see that these detrital zircons, similar to quartz, show that signal of previous Aeolian transport. They're really well-rounded, but they get swept up into rivers and retextured. So we get that dual influence of the Aeolian and the fluvial signal. In contrast, we have a system like the Great Sand Dunes. The Great Sand Dunes are again, definitely a dune system. We went there, we collected the sediment, but this sediment is provided locally by streams. All of the sand is provided right off the mountain front, swept down in these small streams, and then blown into the dune fields. But we don't see the same thing that we see with the Mississippi, right? We don't see that these Great Sand Dunes, even though they're Aeolian, it doesn't plot over next to the other fluvial sites, right? It plots very, very close to the other Aeolian sites. And what this means is that once again, we can see the power of resurfacing in Aeolian environments. You can resurface and retexture a grain much quicker in Aeolian environments than you can subaqueously. Now, let's take this and apply it to the rock record. We've already talked about 3 of these different sites. Let's talk about some really, really old rocks. This is from the Lalorook Formation. It's about 3 billion years old from Australia. This is interpreted as a fluvial metasedimentary rock. And indeed, when we plot it in this parameter space, it plots next to another well-constrained fluvial site. And so we have our fluvial cluster over here on the right. We can take a look at this other grain, or other site, I should say, from the Moody's group in South Africa. This is an image of where the sample was taken from. It's been interpreted as a tidal dune. And when we disaggregate it, and we look at the textures, we can see that it's kind of somewhere in between the beach towards the middle and from the fluvial grain. But if it's in a tidal channel, it's probably likely that the forces acting on a grain in a tidal channel are very similar to those acting on a grain in a river. So it plots along principal component 1, which really divvies up these environments well, relatively close to these fluvial environments. We have our beach samples. Next up, we have grains from the Kuujjuaq Formation. These are, in this case, relatively young at only 780 million years old. And they are sort of a mixed signal. They're somewhere in the middle. You can see from this image that these grains are really well-rounded, but those pits that you can see on the surface of the grain are V-shaped percussion cracks. These are a texture that is really indicative of subaqueous transport. This was interpreted by Robert Rainbird when he sampled this to be a braided river. So you have this massive stack of braided river sands. It's now sandstone, but it's a really wide channel. These grains have been transported an estimated 3,000 kilometers downstream, so a very long transport distance. And there's evidence of subaerial reworking as well. And so this is perhaps analogous to the Mississippi case, where we have Aeolian grains that are being resurfaced by fluvial processes. And similarly for the Kayenta, this is not a metasedimentary rock, it's just sedimentary. But the Kayenta Formation existed at the exact same time as the Navajo Formation. This is a massive paleo-erg. And where we sampled it is in this zone of intertonguing, where we can see Navajo, Kayenta, Navajo stacked on top of one another. And we can see that it really pops out in this analysis where we have the dual influences of both Aeolian and fluvial environments present on this grain. And so it once again plots somewhere in the middle. Next, we have our Vryburg Formation grains. These are from the Neoarchean, about 2.64 billion years old. And these were interpreted by Guzman et al. And some others to be Aeolian. There's high angle crossbedding and the fact that it plots very, very similarly along principal component 1 as the Navajo Formation, that red point directly above it, leads us to believe this really is indeed an Aeolian site. And this is pretty exciting because this is the oldest known dune on Earth. It's a sedimentary rock that is 2.6 billion years old, and it's the oldest known dune on Earth. And finally, we're going to go way, way back in time to the Paleoarchean, the Strelley Formation, at 3.34 billion years old. This sample is from a 15 centimeter thick, interpreted as a sand sheet. This could be contentious because the rocks below it and above it were interpreted as marine or perhaps from an estuary. But when we take a look at the textures in the grain, you can see that it's really well rounded. And in this parameter space is very, very Aeolian. And so if true, this would confirm the oldest known Aeolian deposit on Earth. It's not a dune. It doesn't have the nice crossbedding and other indicators of actual dune activity, but at least sand sheet activity at 3.34 billion years ago. So we have our Aeolian cluster. There's a couple things that can make this sort of analysis more robust. First of all, the rate at which grains are resurfaced is pretty under-constrained. There's a couple ways that we can go about perhaps improving this. First is you can apply uranium-lead dating to identify specific grain populations. So if you went out to a river and you saw 3 distinct peaks from 3 distinct tributaries, and you know how far those grains have traveled, then you can say something about the rates of resurfacing given the observed differences between each of those grains at the same distance. Next up, you can pair zircon and quartz analyses. Zircon and quartz they have differences in hardness and in starting crystal shape. But if you know that they have traveled the same distance, you can look at the relative differences between them to get at rates of resurfacing as compared to quartz. Importantly, it would be really cool if we can automate this, just as we've done with quartz. We tried it. We took Michael's machine learning classifier, Sand AI, and fed the zircon into it, and it didn't do that well. And that's because there's a couple key differences between zircon and quartz. The hardness, of course, but again, the starting shape is different. These zircon grains start very ahedral, which quartz grains do not. But we took a crack at it, we trained it on zircon, and I'm quite excited to share with you some of these results. So, first of all, we have again a ternary diagram where each of the different corners are these environments, and where it plots tells you something about the relative influences of each of those. We have in our fluvial corner grains from the Snoqualmie River, very fluvial. From the auriferous gravels, these are Eocene in age, very fluvial. The Domagene, which is tens of millions of years old as well, also fluvial. We have a couple sites that plot outside of this. The Orange River in Africa plots quite close to the Aeolian sector, but it is very close to the Kalahari. And so it makes sense that these Aeolian grains are being swept in, similar to the Mississippi River. And the Sanghuajian also plots pretty close to beach. It's about 50-50 of each of those, but this was only done on 4 grains. Next up, we have our beach grains. We have Gray Whale and Fort Funston, most decidedly beach. They plot in the beach corner. And the 2 rock record sites that they are pretty beachy don't. However, the Merced formation, this point over here, when plotted in the same parameter space for quartz, the model predicts that it is beach, whereas in the zircon model, it predicts that it's more fluvial. The actual stratigraphy is quite beachy. And so what this might be telling us is exactly one of the points that I brought up previously, that quartz and zircon are being resurfaced at different rates. And similarly, the Moody's, this tidal dune, plots up here close to the Aeolian, but there's a lot of evidence that in the pre-vegetation Earth, which is when these grains are being transported around, there was a much greater influence of Aeolian activity on the surface because there's no plants to slow that down. And so it could be that these grains are indeed being transported across Earth's surface via Aeolian activity, swept into a tidal channel, and then deposited. The most successful is, of course, the Aeolian. These are really, really distinct. And we have grains ranging from the modern, the Rubal Hali, the Namib, and the Kalahari, which are predicted at 100% Aeolian, the Navajo sandstone, which is predicted at 90%, the Vryburg, Sand Mountain, which is another modern grain, the Strelly Pool, that sample that's 3.34 billion years old, 70% Aeolian, and Algodones is quite Aeolian as well. And then we have this other little mini cluster. We have the Kayenta, the Kuujjuaq, and the Mississippi. These are all these Aeolian to fluvial recycle grains, and they all cluster quite closely to one another, which is pretty exciting because these are wildly different in age, where the Mississippi are modern grains, the Kayenta are Jurassic in age, and the Kuujjuaq are Neoproterozoic. Yet they all show the same signature of recycling, where you have initial Aeolian transport followed by fluvial resurfacing. With that, I'd like to conclude. We've shown that the zircon grains retain diagnostic suites of textures on both modern grains and grains disaggregated from ancient sedimentary rocks, that we can use zircon surface textures as an unexploited tool to better interpret Earth's earliest environmental archives. And we believe this is a really powerful tool that we can share with the community. Just as we've done with Sand AI for quartz, we plan on publishing the machine learning model for zircon, as well as the weights for the statistical analysis, so you can do the manual and the automated classification as well. But with that, thank you very much, and I am happy to answer any questions that you'll have.
Wonderful, Colin. Thank you so much. We can start off with James's question. James, do you just want to You want to say it out loud, or I'm happy to read it from the chat.
Sure. We've done some work actually looking at other, not anything sedimentary, but using confocal microscopy, which is like a laser base. It's very similar to SEM, but it allows for extracting specific metrics associated with roughness so that you can kind of have a more quantitative output than you would through SEM. And so I was wondering if you had any ideas or you knew about that kind of approach and if you had any comment associated with sort of advantages, disadvantages.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would say the only disadvantage is that I'm not trained on any of the machinery and how to do this. I am familiar with it, and there are some folks in the Detrital Zircon world who are doing this to try and look at the different starting shapes in different igneous rocks of zircon. So they'll take it and they'll put it in an epoxy and use CT scans to sort of get the really fine scale topography of these grains. I think it'd be pretty fantastic to do for surface textures, and as far as I know, it hasn't been done before.
Colin, I have a question on, you talked a little bit about your sample size. Like at one point, I think you mentioned that you had 50 to 100 images or grains for the zircon samples. And I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate, like generally what sample size for either quartz or zircon are you aiming for? And then B, with your sample collection, especially for the zircon, is there any differences, whether for ancient samples or current day, since it's so hard to find? Like, do you have to change anything about how you're collecting your samples to make sure you have enough?
Yeah, so in terms of sample size, this is something that is still debated in the quartz world. You have people that say that you need 5 grains. You have some people that say you need 500 grains. But the vast majority of folks will agree that somewhere on the order of 10 to 50 grains is good enough. And so with that in mind, we said 50 grains is probably enough given how hard they are to find. Let's stick with that. And so for each of these, we have at least 50 grains. Some have, up to 100 as well, but at least 50, that's our threshold. In terms of collecting them, you can find them relatively easily in many of these environments. There were a couple sites, particularly in beach environments with larger grain sizes, where it is more difficult to get the zircon out. A bit of a bummer. You just have to do more separations, but ultimately, with about half a Dixie cup of sediment, you can get on the order of 10 to 100 zircon, which is
Okay,
good enough for us. Yeah.
great. I have another question, unless someone else wants to raise their hand or anything. Let us know if you have one. Please feel free to jump in. um, you had mentioned, and you probably don't have an answer for this, but I just wanted to like chat about it some more on the mixed signals and like deciphering the mixed signals. And I think it's super cool to see the relationship of like or energy environment and like the differences of fluvial and Aeolian. But from what I heard in your talk, it's really hard to say like a temporal threshold, I guess, of like how long does this grain have to be, removed from a river in an Aeolian dune field to, to like to show up as being an Aeolian grain. Has there been any studies on that?
There's been a couple isolated studies. This is forming chapter 4 of my dissertation, is sort of trying to figure this out, particularly in fluvial environments. And the way that we're doing this is looking at samples collected down the transect of a river. This was done by Sweet and Brennan from 2016. They did this from like a glacial outflow channel all the way down a river for like 200 kilometers, and they documented that. We're doing this for both quartz and zircon. Experimentally using abrasion mills, where we have sand that we know what the starting size and shape and everything is, and transporting it a known distance. And then, taking a look along transects of a river. The Rio Bermejo in South America is a really great way to do this. It's like 1,000 kilometers long with like one tributary. Excellent. Mississippi presents a much more complicated example. We went on a fun 10-day field trip from Louisiana all the way up to Minnesota collecting sand. And this is going to be a nice little test of how we can really apply this, given the amount of tributaries, the age of the sediment. The stuff way up in the headwaters in Minnesota is on the order of 2 billion years old, so it's quite old, likely already been recycled. And then you have the more like modern stuff, the Ice Age stuff, which is all Aeolian, and then being dumped in the Mississippi as well. And so if we can pick up on all that, that would be really cool. But it is work in progress.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely seems, I mean, very cool, very, very difficult, and maybe like like the easiest starting point, since it seems like sand is, you know, most quickly reworked in Aeolian dune fields. Just it'd be cool to see like on our Colorado River dune field sites, like just having a transect of like right next to the river to further back, like if you were how quickly you were seeing changes in the
Yeah.
texture signatures.
Absolutely. And similarly in coastal dune sites, when you're going from a beach to an Aeolian dune. So how long does it take, to texture a grain going up the beach face, up into a dune, into the back dune, for example. All super exciting and low-hanging sand if somebody wants to look at that. Yeah.
We have about a couple more minutes for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or put one in the chat. I can ask one more unless James, you have one.
No, go ahead. I only have anecdotes than questions.
Well, I don't know. I guess I am curious about this just knowing of your previous work, Colin, but is there any differences with, current or like active sand fields, whether it's like Aeolian sand or sand traveling down fluvial system, of like anthropogenic differences that you don't like that you see in current day active moving sand, whatever environment it may be, versus from the rock record? Do you see that in any of your samples?
So not in the zircon. This is not something that we've explored, but in the quartz, it can pop up. It can pop up. And so something that is quite interesting is when folks want a beach. And I do mean that literally. And so you can bring in sand from somewhere else and deposit it to make a beach. And so if you bring that from a river or from a dune, for example, that can definitely pop up. And so this is actually an interesting um, you know, sedimentologic or other application of this work is fingerprinting where sand actually comes from. And so sand mining for construction, IDing where stolen beach sand comes from is all
You're
very
ready to take
relevant
on
for
the
this.
sand mafia.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a very, very real application of this work. And similarly in archaeology, if you have, sand mix into some sort of pottery or something else or building materials, and you have a very limited amount of that, and you want to know where it came from, you can do something like this. And it's even been used in forensics to identify where the sand came from on the bottom of somebody's boot, for example. So
Wow.
there's plenty of applications beyond trying to figure out if you're in a sand dune 2 billion years ago or on a beach, for example.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. I'll just check one more time for any other questions before we wrap up.
I was
Don't
just
see
going to
any.
say that there's also gravel pits that will make sand-sized particles to be kind of beach sand.
Yeah.
And as a person who runs a wind tunnel that needs sand in it, people try and sell you stuff that is
Yes.
apparently sand, but you quickly realize that it's not so rounded. Yeah, it's not real sand.
Yes.
It's interesting you bring
Yeah.
that up because there is some experimental work as well where folks will just take sand and like crush it and grind it. And this is even from the 80s. And there's some really weird and sort of funky stuff going on that doesn't look quite natural. And so you want to send them our way, I'll tell you if it's Aeolian or not real
Well, it's
quick.
pretty obvious after about 5 minutes, the amount of dust it generates, it's pretty telling.
Yeah.
Oof.
Well, thank you again, Colin. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It is being recorded and will eventually be shared on our website, so feel free to check our website. We'll post it as soon as we can. We also want to encourage you to, on our website, you can check your membership status, keeping your ISAR membership up to date. Make sure that you can receive our community updates, such as our quarterly newsletters. Our June newsletter will be coming out soon with many exciting updates, such as we'll be opening up soon the call for our 2026 ISAR awards. Our board has been working hard to actually introduce some new awards, so hopefully you'll check those out. Also, congratulations again to Professor Yaping Xiao, who won the ISAR Distinguished Career Award for 2025. He will be giving our next ISAR talk in June. So all that is, will be sent out through our membership list. So check that your membership's up to date. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at the email address admin@aeolianresearch.com. You can find that on our website as well. Colin has it shown right there. And those are all of the updates I have. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and thank you again, Colin.